The performance of Neighborhood tries to look at the rise of the public theater and the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which grew and expanded during this time, which seems a little bit contradictory to have these largely city-funded theaters growing during a time of fiscal crisis. But there's a reason why that contradiction happened, and that's what I was interested in looking at. So the producer of the Public Theater and also the creator of Shakespeare in the Park, Joseph Papp, he was really interested in this idea of public, as in public theater. And he essentially said, we can't think of theater as just Shakespeare as classical. We need to actually think about something like classical theater as a public service, essentially as garbage collection. That was the comparison that he made. So it's actually significant that he said we need to think about theater as garbage collection, because at this time, what was being cut? It was essentially garbage service. There were neighborhoods in which there were basically literally bags of trash lining the streets. Not every neighborhood. You could probably guess which neighborhoods had trash bags lining the streets. So it's interesting to think a little bit about how Joseph Papp, at this point, gets this really sweet plum job at Lincoln Center, which is like the bastion of high quality arts when it was created. And he says he wants to do something really new at Lincoln Center. He wants to bring new plays, new exciting plays for young people. And he fails in that. It was 1973, and he tried to elevate new young playwrights, David Rabe, Miguel Pinheiro. And part of what I look at is the first play that he chose to produce there was called In the Boom Boom Room. It was by David Rabe. It's a really, really dark play about a naive go-go dancer. And that was the play that started irate letters pouring in from the subscribers. And I went to Lincoln Center to the theater library and read all of these really irate subscriber letters. And it was actually before the plays had even been produced. It was just the announcement of the 1973-1974 theater season, his very first, producing at Lincoln Center, when he started getting letters from subscribers canceling their memberships. So a number of them were extremely unhappy because there had been a bunch of articles, a bunch of news articles in which Papp had talked about soliciting new audiences for Lincoln Center. So he wrote a New York Times op-ed where he said, New York theaters operate in denial of, quote, the exodus of great numbers of white middle class to the suburbs. So this is a moment of great white flight out of the city and into the suburbs. So when he assumed leadership of the Beaumont and Lincoln Center, he was trying to find an antidote to the fact that there were so many white audience members fleeing and he was losing theater attendance. And he said, well, I want to find anyway plays that reflect what's actually happening in the city. So he said, you know what, I want to bring middle class, black, and white New Yorkers to the theater, and I also want to target the Puerto Rican middle class. He wrote this in an op-ed. And he also set targets for attracting audiences. But the largely white subscriber base, which was 40,000 subscribers at that time, actually interpreted this as undermining the classics and messing with what they viewed as the central city stage, which was Lincoln Center. The most offensive subscriber defections actually questions his allegiance to the classics. So I have here a, next slide. Yes, so this one is one of the more irate subscriber letters from June 1973. This is from the records of the New York Shakespeare Festival, and a subscriber wrote, I do not wish the theater to play a role in urban society. Which, of course, as a researcher, that's what my whole project was about. Should theater play a role in urban society, and what should it be? So when you find a letter like this that basically is answering your research question, that's a great moment. And to add minority theater goers, if that means eliminating classic theater and producing another Shaft in Africa. And I should say, Shaft in Africa is not even a play, it's a movie. Blacks and Hispanics in the USA are American and not a separate people. The melting pot of our country has taken numerous minorities, brought them in, and taught them the classics. I believe Euripides, Shakespeare, and Ibsen can present the problems of any people far better than the Pigpen or the Chicken Coop Chinaman. So This is interesting in so many ways. We could probably just talk about this for the rest of the day, actually. But I will say, in terms of research, one of the things that was really exciting to me about this is that, you can be studying and studying and studying and studying the subject, and there's still so much that you miss. It was this letter that made me go look up Chicken Coop Chinaman and the Pigpen, because there were so many plays happening at this time that you don't quite know which ones were flashpoints at the time. So Frank Chin was the playwright of the Chicken Coop Chinaman, and one of the reasons why it's very ironic that this person mentioned that is because that play actually tries to dismantle questions of stereotyping and racial identity. It's a really difficult play. It was his first play. It's semi-autobiographical, and he's basically asking questions about Asian American masculinity in that play. Shaft in Africa, as I mentioned, is a 1973 blaxploitation film, and Pigpen is a 1970 play by Ed Bullins, who was the playwright in residence at a theater in Harlem. And it was set in 1965 at a party that was attended by both young white and black bohemian intellectuals, and it really satirizes black and white liberal culture. So it's not like this person chose two plays that were incredibly radical in their politics. These were radical plays, but they were actually critiques of stereotyping and of reductive understandings of identity. But as you can see from this letter, it was just Pap's decision to stage these plays that tapped into this extreme discomfort that was alive in the city at that time, which was that these subscribers would actually rather avoid going to Lincoln Center than be forced to sit through plays that they felt were expressing either certain political ideologies or just showing different representations of what were the city's subjects at that time. So the subscriber cancellations actually went from dozens to hundreds, and by the time Pap produced Miguel Piñero's Short Eyes, I think I have a next slide of it, that was a play set in Sing Sing. This one over here, I think that might be from the film. I think they made a film of Short Eyes. And Miguel Piñero based it on actual events in Sing Sing prison. That was in May 1974. And at that point, the subscriber base dropped from 40,000 to 16,000. So you could say that this was truly a failed experiment in many ways. And part of what interested me about this is that it was clear that there was a kind of consensus of this theatrical public sphere at Lincoln Center that didn't quite match Pap's artistic and political vision for the city. And there's a theater scholar named Christopher Baum who says that there are all of these contradictions in how theatrical public sphere formation happens. Heavily debated performance, so really like performance flashpoints, can reestablish contact between the theatrical and political public sphere, but a lot of times these performances haven't even been performed yet. It's actually just the threat of them. It's like in this instance, where just a season announcement actually altered the course of the theater at Lincoln Center and led eventually to Pap resigning from there. I can't recall offhand the year that he resigned. So essentially, subscribers were fighting for the dramatic literature that they believed upheld a kind of mirror to their own sphere. And this also reflected the media coverage at this time, which was basically a very conservative response to the fiscal crisis. And it said, it's recent immigrants, it's poor whites, it's unemployed blacks and Latinos that are draining the city funding and creating the fiscal crisis. And that is part of what I was seeing was fueling a lot of these subscriber defections. And the subscribers themselves, and this is true, this was in the model, they saw themselves as supporting Lincoln Center, and at that moment decided that that was not the right visibility level that they wanted for a city stage. So one thing that I contrast this example with, next slide, is the Brooklyn Academy of Music, because they, actually go back one, I'm not quite ready. So the Brooklyn Academy of Music I have as a really successful example of institutional investment at this moment on about BAM is actually the interdependence. So there's this, if you read anything about BAM, this time is often remembered for the work that its incredible executive director, who actually just recently retired, the work that he did to basically resuscitate BAM when it was in the middle of a very difficult neighborhood in Brooklyn that was essentially being divested. And he built essentially what is now one of the premier performance spaces in New York at that moment. So it usually focuses on this sort of like great man theory. And part of what I was interested in doing here is to look at the network of cultural organizations and all of the smaller neighborhood theaters that were around BAM at this time that were actually helping the theater to grow into what it is today. So I look at one theater company called Everyman, which was a really wonderful theater company. It was a street theater company that used to perform at BAM, and that BAM used to use in all of their advertising materials because they wanted to show that they were invested in the community. And a lot of the popular origin story that we remember is that actually BAM's renaissance didn't begin until the 1980s, when more avant-garde performers like John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Laurie Anderson, Robert Wilson. There's kind of a known cast of characters that are credited with rejuvenating BAM. But I was interested in that really dark period of the 70s when, in order to halt the decline of its audiences, BAM started bringing in new playwrights and new theater companies. And its programming was actually inspired by philosophies of community control that were essentially really brewing in the neighborhoods right near BAM. So to do this, they started initiating performance-based dialogues. And they tried choosing dramas that actually focused on the urban neglect that was happening right in that neighborhood in Brooklyn. So the play that I looked at was called The Long Black Block. That was by Roger Furman. And he mounted the show at BAM in 1972 after he had already mounted it at his New Heritage Theater in Harlem. And it was produced in 2 short runs at BAM, one in 73, and then they brought it back in 75. And the play is a really fascinating example of how you dramatize spatial segregation in neighborhoods and how that creates tensions between public and private, particularly at a moment of municipal crisis. So Furman's play opens with a kind of blues prologue, a singing, that laments the youth of the neighborhood who were being sent off to fight in Vietnam. And the street that was on stage, that was represented on stage, was supposed to represent a street in Harlem, but it was also representative of brownstones in Brooklyn. The setting itself captured a lot of the frustrations of the residents in those brownstones. And the building super, who's one of the main characters, is a Mrs. Zelda R. Howards. She watches over the house in the block. She lives in the basement. And she basically condemns the power dynamics in the neighborhood. A quote that she says early on in the play is, "We don't have any kind of real black power like they've been talking about. And you know damn well that we don't have any money." And after we meet her, we meet a couple who are trying to escape the neighborhood and everything that's going on there. And the woman, Lottie, is dreaming of a career in the theater, and she wants to perform alongside her stage idol, Ruby Dee. And her boyfriend, Van, also has a plan to get to help the neighborhood, but he wants to stay in the neighborhood. He wants to invest in political action, and he has a plan for community control that will take over their derelict buildings that the city wanted to essentially demolish. So Lottie tells Van that he's just about Mickey Mouse revolutionary jive, and she tells him that she has an opportunity to actually get out of the neighborhood and go on the road with a touring production of a play. And when she does that, her boyfriend Van retaliates. So I'll preface this slide and just mention that there's a racial slur on this slide, which if this were a class, we'd be able to talk about it in the context and discuss what it does in terms of the language of the play. But for now, I'm going to skip reading it aloud. So this is what Van tells Lottie in the play when she tells him she wants to go on tour with the show. She says, "You know damn well ain't raising no hell on Broadway or any other way. Girl, you know you've got to have a big name to make it in this country. Why don't you join the little theater group over at the Women's Y? At least you'll be doing something that you like. Forget all of that big time stuff." So when I read that, I thought that it was such a prescient statement by this character, because what I was finding in a lot of my research is that actually there were many people like Lottie who were saying the city's population is changing, and I actually have a chance in this new landscape of theater, including mainstream theater. I don't actually need to be at the Y anymore. And many, especially many white producers, were very slow to change their practices. And many audiences were very slow to figure out if they could trust those bigger spaces. So at that moment, the fiscal crisis was kind of stoking all of these fears of a declining audience base at the very, very moment that young people like Lottie were saying, oh, I have an opportunity in the theater now. They're actually writing parts for me. They're actually producing shows for me. So you had this kind of disjuncture. And part of the disjuncture was between centralized elite cultural destinations and then those with ties to actually decentralized theater and community movements that began in the 1960s, the kind of movement that Van really represents. And Roger Furman's work was interesting to me because it really typified the collaborations that changed the way that I thought about these theater venues during the fiscal crisis. So when the play was first presented in Brooklyn, it's interesting to contrast a little bit the way that it was received. The New York Times critiqued it. They said the scenes are too long, the characters are too broad, it was not well reviewed. But if you look at the review from the Amsterdam News, which was a historically black newspaper, actually the writer says this was a wild experience. He actually described it as a wild experience. It sounds like you're reading two different reviews. A second review in that same newspaper, the Amsterdam News, said this play actually diminishes the separation between art and audience. The spectators are collaborating in upending the conventions of Western theater. And the reviewer said, how do you review an audience that becomes its own performance? So I found that, talking about the kind of questions that circulate when you're doing research, and I saw this popping up in a lot of the papers, theater is so ephemeral. There's no way to understand whether you would have felt like Mel Gassau from the New York Times or whether you would have felt like these two reviewers from the Amsterdam News. But holding those two things side by side actually shed a lot of light on the tensions that were happening at the time, which included the fact that the New York Times was being criticized for not reviewing plays like this. So there are, of course, a lot of backgrounds to any question that you had. And I guess because I'm probably running a little bit low on time, I'll end on Roger Furman. So if you could go to the next slide, because I think it's kind of instructive. In terms of these questions about what do we study, why do we study, when do we study it, Roger Furman created the New Heritage Repertory Theater, Inc., which was one of the oldest black theater groups in New York. He established it in 1965 in Harlem. And in 1970, he had actually established it with federally financed anti-poverty money. And this is a story that goes through the whole book. In the 60s, theater company got anti-poverty money to create new theaters. In the 70s, they had no money. Then they disappeared. And that was a very sad, very repetitive process. And he talked a little bit, if you go to the next slide, about his experience running his theater in Harlem. In 1971, he said, we have to pay $300 a month